But now to the best. In terms of form, in terms of actually holding everything together in a beautiful, integrated, integral entirety, John Donne, I think, is a superior poet to Robert Southall and Richard Crashaw, and he's superior to George Herbert, another favorite metaphysical poet. So I think he might be the best. And you know what? I think the secret to John Donne's success in terms of today, in terms of his popularity, is the fact he's a modern, in some sense. And if
in a nutshell, about literature with Joseph Pearcem. Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I am Jan Franczak and this is part 46 of In a Nutshell about literature with Joseph Pearcem. In the previous episode we discussed the idea of metaphysical conceit. In this one we are continuing the topic and taking a cursory look at the most important of the metaphysical poets, whose poetry is worth reading and why.
We finished our previous conversation on the topic of metaphysical poets and metaphysical conceit. And we explained the idea of the conceit, and you said that it reminds of kind of Chestertonian paradox, yes? And I would like to continue for a while this topic, but there is one question that I thought about. Why actually metaphysical poets? Why not, I don't know, religious poets, Christian poets? Why do we call them metaphysical poets?
that's actually a very good question, Jan. I'm not sure I've ever actually studied it or pursued it. I think the key thing is the connection between a metaphor and metaphysics. In other words, that the metaphoric and the metaphysical conceit is metaphorical, where you're bringing two things together that don't necessarily, you wouldn't think they belong together. You bring them together metaphorically to open out the mind into a new way of seeing whatever it is you're talking about. So that would be my guess, is that the metaphor is itself a metaphysical device for conveying meaning. But of course, the other more literal and obvious meaning is that they, for the most part, were writing on religious subjects as opposed to worldly things. So they're not looking at the physical world, they're looking beyond the physical world to the metaphysical cosmos. So they are religious poets for the most part. But my guess would be, as regards metaphysical, except rather than just religious, was because of the way they were talking about religion, this sort of metaphorical way, rather than just praising the Lord or what have you. That would be my guess, but I am guessing because I haven't actually pursued that in terms of what other critics over the years have said. So I honestly don't know for sure.
Yes, I've just asked because I suppose many people use this term, but don't think too much about it, just treat it as a group name. And now there are different poets that are ranked into this group of the metaphysical poets, like John Donne, George Herbert, Richard Crashaw. Also, I see that in anthologies, there is, for example, there are poems by Shakespeare, by Ben Jonson included. And I suppose that at the moment, one of the most known, best known metaphysical poets is John Donne. And I even, if you take an anthology of the metaphysical poets translated into Polish. So I suppose that a large part of it will be poetry by John Donne. I also remember, for example, from my studies, a beautiful poem by a Russian poet, Joseph Brodsky, the great elegy for John Donne, which was, as far as I know, translated into English too, right? But that a poet is the best known, it doesn't necessarily mean that he's really the best. What would be your choice if you wanted to recommend any poets to our viewers?
That's a great question. And again, I'll go back to something we talked about before, the difference between favorite and best. So obviously favorite is a subjective choice based upon what my personal predilections, my personal delights are. Whereas to say the best is the one you think that all things together, irrespective of my own personal taste, this poet is probably the best. So my favorite of the metaphysical poets, if you're not going to include Shakespeare, and you could, as you've rightly said, if you're not going to include Shakespeare, my favorite is probably, well, you know, I'm showing my Catholic bias here. It would be a toss up between Robert Southall, right at the beginning of the metaphysical period, and Richard Crashaw right at the end. They're about 50 years apart. But I love both of them. I think Richard Crashaw tends to be a little bit repetitive with his devices, but now to the best. In terms of form, in terms of actually holding everything together in a beautiful, integrated, integral entirety, John Donne, I think, is a superior poet to Robert Southall and Richard Crashaw, and he's superior to George Herbert, another favorite metaphysical poet. So I think he might be the best. And you know what? I think the secret to John Donne's success in terms of today, in terms of his popularity, is the fact he's a modern. In some sense. And if you don't mind, I edited this book, Poems Every Catholic Should Know, which we talked about before. There are some of these selected here, but I have quotes from people. And so these are two great poets talking about John Donne as the epigraph to my section on John Donne in this. So first of all, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and then T.S. Eliot. And I'd like to discuss both, but especially Eliot's very brief epigraph here. So Coleridge, with Donne, whose muse on dromedary trots, wreath iron pokers into true love knots, rhymes sturdy cripple, fancies maze and clue, wits forge and fire blast, meanings press and screw. So that's Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And then Eliot this is prose, it's just a sentence plucked from one of his critical essays. Donne is the antithesis of the scholastic. All right, so Eliot's talking in terms of Donne's philosophy, but let's look very briefly at Coleridge. Now, Coleridge, of course, one of the greatest of the Romantic poets. This is a great poet paying tribute to a great poet. So he talks about Donne's muse, so his inspiration, his inspirational gift, on dromedary trots. Now, a dromedary is a camel. So it sort of plods along like a camel. It's not steaming ahead. It's not running around like a cheetah or a jaguar. It's trotting along like a camel. I mean, what does that mean, right? Because he's not rushing ahead. Why? Because he's wreath iron pokers. So, a rod of iron we poke the fire with, twisting that into true love knots, taking this something really solid, really straight, and doing things with it. So what is this twisting and turning of this straight iron poker into a knot? It's the use of metaphor, of conceit, of bringing things together, twist them together so that we're seeing this straight thing in a different light because it's in a different shape. Rhymes sturdy cripple, fancies maze and clue, wits forge and fire blast. So as if his wit is in a furnace, right? And it's his wit, his own gift, which is hammering these pokers into shape. So this really sturdy, and of course, meanings press and screw. So again, the stuff of the blacksmith. Now, by the way, this is Coleridge is also being a metaphysical poet here, bringing all these different imageries together. A muse is like a camel, that his rhymes, his poetic form is like a blacksmith, hammering things into shape. This is he's practicing what Donne practiced, a metaphysical poet. So this is a great tribute to Donne's skill as a poet. But then Eliot, Donne is the antithesis of the scholastic. And of course, the scholastic is the scholastic philosopher, the metaphysical philosopher, right? The philosopher of metaphysics, such as St. Thomas Aquinas, right? Duns Scotus, these great medieval philosophers. So when Eliot says that Donne is the antithesis of that, what he's really saying is that Donne's theology and philosophy is actually somewhat utilitarian, which is why he's struggling with his faith, because he's got one foot in the world and one foot at least trying to walk towards heaven, right? So there's this sense of conflict in Donne, as that yes, he wants God, particularly in his earlier poetry. There is an element of serenity that enters later on, but early poetry, there's this struggle because he's a Christian, yes, he wants to believe, but and the but is the but, and I think part of the problem is that Donne, as a young man, breaks with the Catholic Church. He apostatizes and turns away, and I think that psychologically and theologically causes a breach in him, because he has to, if you like, break from that whole scholastic tradition, that whole continuum of the church's philosophy and theology, and embrace something new. And that does violence, I think, to who he is as a person who was raised. He's a relative of St. Thomas. At least his ancestors were relatives of St. Thomas More. He come from a Catholic family in times of intense anti-Catholic persecution, and he capitulates. He doesn't want martyrdom. He wants worldly comfort. So that conflict in the heart of Donne, I think we see played out in his work, which is why he's not my favorite, because I prefer good, solid Catholic poets and poetry. But that doesn't mean that along with Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Eliot, who are both great admirers of Donne, that I obviously admire Donne as a poet.
Mm-hmm. So it means that this conflict gives this poetry a kind of dynamic, yes? But then my question is, because I would like to recommend good books, especially to a Catholic reader. Is it safe for a Catholic reader to read this poetry, or should a Catholic reader read it with caution, and beware of some, I don't know, some heretical fragments or something like that?
Yeah, you mentioned the word dynamic. But the other word I think we need is tension. There's a dynamic tension in his poetry, and that dynamic tension is a theological tension and a philosophical tension. So should we read Donne? Well, I would say yes. The only way that I would say someone shouldn't read Donne is if they could be corrupted by him. And that would really be a child or someone who has a sort of simplistic understanding of things. Someone who is a child or has simplistic understanding of things is not going to read Donne because they won't understand him. So in other words, if you're mature enough as a grown-up reader to read and enjoy Donne, you presumably have also grown up enough to have a sense of discernment, and you can work out, if Donne's saying things that are a little bit peculiar with respect to your understanding orthodox theology and philosophy.
Do the metaphysical poets actually have any influence on modern English poetry? You mentioned Coleridge and T.S. Eliot, but do they still have any influence?
Well, still as in today, that's a good question, because there's two worlds of poetry today. There's the secular poetry world, which is completely, as far as I can see, and I don't look very far in that direction, so I don't see very much. It's completely corrupt. They've broken with form. It's about iconoclasm. It's about decadence. It's about blasphemy at its worst. I think these people are modernists in the theological sense of the word, in the sense that and progressive in the relativist sense of the word. That there's nothing really to learn from the past, from the great heritage, from the tradition. So I doubt that the past has much of an influence upon that secular school of poetry. But if I could show you, if I could turn my whole computer around, but that would be dangerous. Things would go wrong. But there's a whole shelf, probably of 70 volumes of 21st century Catholic poetry by Catholic poets. And I'd absolutely say yes, the metaphysical poets are alive and well as inspiration to these poets, and indeed that inheritance breathes its way through the poetry of many of these poets. So it's a living legacy. It's alive, but it's only alive in those who are alive to the past. So certainly contemporary Catholic poetry is. Contemporary secular poetry, I suspect, is not.
Thank you for watching. If you haven't seen the previous episodes yet, please check the In a Nutshell About Literature playlist. You can watch them individually or as 7 longer compilation videos. And please remember, you can support the development of this channel in several ways. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done it yet, like this video and leave a comment. Share the video by copying the link and posting it on our social media. And finally, support us financially by buying me a virtual cup of coffee or making a donation. Please check the options below the video, where you'll find links to 2 services, Buy Coffee 2 and Zrzutka. You can also support this channel by doing the shopping in my online store. Please check out what you can get there. The link you can also find below the video. Thank you once again, and see you in the next episode of In a Nutshell About Literature with Joseph Pearcem. God bless you.